appreciate everybody joining. Hope your summer's going well. It's been it seems like almost a full year now we've been hosting these webinar series, and we're very appreciative of your time joining us, and love the fact you guys are willing to learn more about the system, the solution, and different ways that we can create some efficiencies for you. As we mentioned before, today's meeting is about enabling better workflows to DFdiscover. As you might have noticed, we've added the functionalities of randomization as well as eConsent through Diamind. So today we're going to talk about how to enable that and just some of the key impacts that'll bring to your study teams and different ways that you'll be able to create efficiencies and save money there in your startup time. So with that, we have some questions in the chat throughout the meeting that we'll go over at the end of the call. So please feel free to hop in there and add any questions you like. If for some reason the chat functionality isn't working, feel free to reach out to me directly. It's Anthony@dfnetresearch.com. And finally, if you have to leave early or weren't able to attend, we'll have a recording going out to you later this week as well if you were to register. As well as any other recordings that we might have missed for other webinars, we'll have recordings on the website as well. So for today's conversation, if you don't know me, I'm Anthony Veracali. I'm our Director of Sales. I've been with the company now for a little over a year, and I'm joined by Laura Joldersma. She'll be talking about some of the integration pieces as well on the DFdiscover side. And Alex Lemnaru, he's the CEO, founder of Diamind, and he'll be talking about the integration from the Diamind side and discussing different ways that the eConsent randomization tool can be enabled in DFdiscover and some of the industry trends as well today. So before I jump into the webinar stuff here, just a quick reminder, DFUG is coming up, which is crazy. I feel like we were just there, but here we are just over 2 months away. It's going to be in Boston this year, and we have a buy one, get one promotion running right now, and that's going to be running through August 1st, which is next week. So if you guys want to take advantage of that promotion, please try our best to get that approved internally, and we'll do our best to make sure you're locked in for DFUG there. But again, it's in Boston, same week as SCDM. It's going to be on Thursday and a Friday. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Happy to support. Again, before I start the webinar here, I always like to take a moment just to shed some light on additional areas which DFnet can support beyond DFdiscover. And perhaps your team might find themselves in a scenario where there's some turnover, or maybe there's a project coming up in your pipeline that needs an extra set of hands to manage data, or maybe do some biostats work. Essentially, we have some DFnet team members that can be deployed on your team whenever needed, and they'll help fill some of those gaps. It could be on a month-to-month basis, could be for a year, but some of those services are including database build and setup, creating SAPs and randomization plans. We can do clinical coding, TLF support, and more services as well. But if you think that'd be useful, please drop a message here in the chat, or you feel free to reach out to any DFnet team member, and I'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar here. You can go to the next slide. For the topic of today, though, again, DFnet and Diamind have been hard at work creating an integration to simplify the workflow of sending and receiving some of the data from eConsent randomization modules into DFdiscover. And we recognize that in order for our partners to be successful, we really want to create those efficiencies for your study teams and reduce unnecessary steps where possible. And this is certainly a step in the right direction of accomplishing that. And just please know there's more to come as well. Today's just an intro, so if you'd like a demo setup after this, happy to do so. But without stealing any thunder from their presentation, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague here, Alex, to introduce himself and his company, Diamind.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anthony. Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Lemnaru, and as Anthony mentioned, I'm the founder of Diamind Solutions. So we have partnered with DFnet to improve some of the workflows and capabilities. As you already know, the ADC capabilities in DFnet and some of the other services and modules are absolutely fantastic. However, we also thought that there are additional opportunities and efficiencies that can be gained by integrating some of the newer capabilities. So this includes, for today, we're going to be discussing about eConsent and randomization. So these are the two key aspects, obviously, in any clinical trial. And these are some of the areas that can take either a lot of time or can be optimized and provide a lot of efficiency. So in the area of randomization, in the area of eConsent, one of the key aspects is to move away from paper forms. It's a lot easier now to do everything electronically, especially when some patients or decision makers or their legal representatives are not available on site. So being able to do a combination of paper, electronic, and online, and improving those processes are critical for eConsent. And from a randomization perspective, by leveraging the new algorithms, we can actually work on reducing sample sizes, which is extremely important, and as well as have flexible methods that actually work based on what's happening in the site in the trial real life. So you don't have to wait until you have to finish group, subgroup B, C, D. That still requires 2 more patients at site X. So being able to have things that adapt to your life trial scenario are extremely important in today's environment. And can we go to the next slide, please? So we'll be starting with consent first. And the capabilities with eConsent are, first of all, the integration component. So we want to make sure that we have a solution that integrates with the DFdiscover EDC so that you don't have to redo any manual data entry, the data flows, as well as making sure that you can do the electronic paper and so on and have everything available electronically. So that you're reducing your data traffication, your storage costs, as well as having support for both trials that do in person. So when you have your acute trials or things where the patient is in person, but as well as supporting trials where the patient or the substitute decision maker or the surrogate consent are not available and you need to consent them remotely. Last but not least, it's important to have custom workflows to be able to meet the actual requirements so that you don't have to worry about, I need form 5, I need form 6, I need the informed consent, I need assent, making sure that the system recognizes the scenario and has that custom workflow capability for you, as well as making sure that it's compliant with legislation. So being able to manage the security requirements for both electronic and or digital signatures. Next slide, please. In terms of the consent methods, so it's very important to recognize that based on each trial, you're going to essentially have 3 major methods that are used. So paper, that's a method that everyone has been using for quite some time since we started doing clinical trials, and we wanted to still make sure that that workflow is supported. So you can upload, if part of the process or the entire process still needs to be done on paper for certain sites, you can upload and have that electronically available in the system as well. But outside of just having paper, we want to make sure that we support electronic use cases. So those are use cases when you have a device like a tablet that's available in the facility or the hospital, and then participants and staff can share the tablet and they can all sign together. So this is essentially, instead of having to deal with paper forms, you deal with an electronic tablet that gets passed around. And then email, obviously, for being used to share a secure link, can be done by email or SMS, and making sure that participants are created an account and identity, and then they can sign the consent forms remotely, as well as access them through a patient portal. Next slide, please. One key important aspect, and I'm not going to go into all of the details between what's a secure electronic signature versus what's a digital signature and so on. What's important to know is that there are multiple levels and multiple standards that guide the security, compliance, and repudiation or non-repudiation capabilities of signatures. And we want to make sure that we support all of those capabilities. So if you want to do secure electronic signatures or if you want to do digital signatures with certificates, all of these solutions are available. And the reason why this is important is because it makes sure that it's easy to use for everyone, as well as that it's secure and compliant. So generating things like signature certificates, having all the verification, hashes, thumbprints, PKI infrastructure, and so on, being able to support all of those capabilities. Next slide, please. In terms of the eConsent form styles, so right now in the industry, there are 2 major styles that are being used. So one is the HTML style and one is the PDF style. So PDF is simply upload your existing consent document PDF, you mark the signatures where you want to place them, and then that process gets done. This is a fantastic process, and if you use tools like some of the other vendors are offering, you've probably seen this. I won't giving any names in this webinar, but you've probably seen this with most of the major solutions. They offer the PDF solution. But what's also important, we also wanted to make sure that we offer an HTML solution, because if you ever tried to e-consent a patient on a mobile phone or on a small screen, you're going to notice that the PDF, the zooming in and out, is not very user-friendly, especially when you're dealing with a population that may have some difficulties in reading or accessing content. So that's why we also support HTML styles that are able to render and have a larger font size, larger screen size. They adapt to the screen better than a PDF, so that you are able to use that HTML style in those scenarios when needed. Next slide. Another important aspect to consider is your different workflows. And obviously, depending on the type of trial, if you're doing an interventional trial, acute trials, and so on, there's a lot of things to consider. But the most important thing is you want to make sure that the system works based on your needs. You don't want a system where every document is the same or you don't know what needs to happen. So in acute scenarios, especially where the time to treat is crucial, you want to make sure that you can finish that consent process within a couple of minutes and get to treating the patient, because otherwise the time to treat will be delayed, and then the actual positive, hopefully positive impact on the treatment will be more difficult to observe if you do not have a good workflow system set in place. By having a good one, you can actually reduce the consent workflow time to a couple of minutes, which is ideal for those acute cases where every minute does matter. So just to give you a quick example of how it can work in an acute trial. So you can have the eligible patient, the physician can identify, do they have the capacity to consent? If yes, that's simple, that's the best case scenario, we consent them. Well, what happens if they don't? In a lot of acute scenarios, the patient may not be responsive or may not have the mental capacity to consent. In that case, the surrogate or legal authorized representative will be identified. We can start that process. We can enroll the patient, administer treatment, and then the system will automatically know to handle the functions for regain capacity when the patient hopefully regains consciousness and is capable of providing consent. But there's also the case when that doesn't happen. The patient arrived in the emergency room. It's an acute trial. Let's say we're dealing with stroke, and the patient is not unable to consent. Surrogate is not available. We need an emergency consent. So that requires the two-physician process. Generally, depends on which state you're in, but the general requirements are you need to have two different physicians. They would say yes. They would evaluate if the patient is eligible, if it's in their interest to be enrolled in the trial. The system handles all the paperwork, workflows, and so on. They fill out the paperwork, they enroll the patient, and after the patient hopefully gains capacity, they go back and you do the consent after emergency consent for the patient, so you enable that workflow. If the patient, after a set amount of time as defined by your REB, the patient does not meet those requirements, you'd go and you do the LAR, or you find a surrogate, hopefully by that point, and get them to consent. And then hopefully, at a later point in time when the patient regains capacity, you do the regain capacity. Or in the unfortunate scenario where that doesn't happen, then you not need to take further action, but everything that was done up to this point to be documented in case there is a legal review that happens. So this is just to show you some of the complexities and capabilities of the system. And all of these can be turned on and off or customized based on your specific trial needs, while being able at each step to change if you want to use electronic, paper, email, or other methods. So this is just to give you an idea of the flexibility. Can we go on the next slide, please? One of the other use cases that's important is the integration of the ePro workflows. So when you want to record patient recorded outcomes, you want to have an integrated, streamlined workflow. So you can have the participant that's ready to consent. So you would send them the info. They would say that yes. Obviously, if they're not willing to consent, then you cannot enroll them in the study, and that workflow ends early. But if they are ready to consent, you can send them. You can have the system send them an email. Hopefully they will provide affirmative consent. If not, then obviously you cannot do anything else, but that's recorded. And after the consent is provided, the system will automatically send an email with the ePro access details so that the patient can continue recording their outcomes in the application there. So it's one other thing where you can have the entire workflow integrated as opposed to having to manually do emails, user IDs, accounts, passwords, and everything. The system can take care of all of that. Next slide. Laura will be showing a little bit more to actually see the demonstration. But in terms of general steps of the process for obtaining eConsent, you'll be identifying the consent type and method. So that's the who, the how, and the what. So who's obtaining the consent, who is giving the consent, how is the consent being obtained. Then you would have the parties review and sign. So the system will make sure that the appropriate parties, so the authorized roles and users, are the ones that are signing. The user will be able to depending on the system options, to be able to either type, draw the electronic signatures, or if we use digital signatures, those will be applied as well as you'll be able to define custom fields and forms that are part of the consent that can be recorded at that time. After that, the PDF with all the electronic and or digital signatures is generated, as well as the signature certificate to verify the authenticity of the PDF and to be able to verify the signatures, facsimile, and so on. So all of that information is generated, is shared with the participant, and then the data is pushed into DFdiscover, into the consent plate that you would have set up, so that you have access to the information there for people that may not necessarily have access to identifiable information. In terms of how that integration looks, so you're going to see the process in the video in a couple of minutes, but from a DFdiscover integration, after the consent process is complete, this is a consent plate as an example of a potential consent plate. Obviously, this can be configured and changed as well. And then the metadata will be pushed to DFdiscover, which includes your consent date and time, your type and method, the person obtaining consent, if there's an investigator certifying the consent, as well as other data elements that may be needed. So this is a simple example, and you'll be able to see more in the video in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So we've talked about consent, but the other important aspect is randomization. So without going into all the statistics, why does randomization matter? Why do we care about the state-of-the-art algorithms? Why do we care about all this? Well, the important aspect is we want to minimize the sample size without losing statistical power. The reason why we choose sample size is obviously we want to make sure that we can detect an effect, so that we can know that if the new medication treatment actually has a positive effect, or at least it's not inferior, depending on type of trial. And the important aspect is by minimizing the sample size and by playing that balancing game, by requiring less subjects, it's less time and less cost, which is extremely important. The other aspect is that you want to be able to adapt to study enrollment challenges and realities. What happens if a site drops out? What happens if a new site pops in? What happens if their enrollment targets cannot be met or need to be changed? What happens if we have multiple stratification factors and we're going to end up with an empty subgroup? Well, this is the part where new advanced algorithms can help, as well as making sure that obviously we support both online and offline modalities. We need to recognize that internet tends to fail us at the most inappropriate time. So being able to have solutions that do not necessarily require an internet connection, as well as making sure that everything is secure compliant, as well as integrates with DFdiscover. Next slide, please. In terms of randomization algorithms, there's a lot of things that can be said. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of what's supported. So we support both static and adaptive algorithms. Static algorithms are when you generate the randomization list ahead of time. So the gold standard for that is permitted blocks. Pretty much most clinical trials up to this point have used this algorithm, and essentially, or a variation of it. And essentially, this requires a predefined randomization list. And then depending on the number of stratification factors, you split blocks, factors, sites, and so on. The disadvantage of this is that it requires you to generate the list ahead of time. And because of stratification, when you have a lot of covariates, you are going to have a significantly higher sample size. On the other side, to improve some of the inefficiencies in the static algorithms, we have adaptive algorithms. So these are algorithms where the randomization list is not pre-generated. It's dynamically generated at the time of enrollment for each patient. And here we have two general standards that are being used, either minimization or minimum sufficient balance. So both of these can lower the sample size, but with minimization is a deterministic algorithm and doesn't work well with non-categorical variables. So there are some limitations with the minimization algorithm. And while it's excellent in what it does, we do believe that the minimum sufficient balance type algorithms represent the future, because those allow both the advantages of having a dynamic randomization list, as well as lowering the sample size without increasing the error rate by making sure that it supports continuous variables as well, and making sure that it looks at compound error rates. So we can talk a little bit more if people are interested in statistics, but this is a quick overview of why these algorithms are important. If we can go to the next slide, we're going to see what does this mean in real patient terms. So with adaptive randomizations, with MSB, you can easily reduce your sample size by 20% or more. So as quick examples, and these are examples from studies that we have worked with, So if you have a 7 covariate study and you're looking at a P of 0.005, so essentially power of 95%, with a standard permitted block algorithm, you will be requiring around 1,367 participants to be able to have the statistical power that you need. Again, this obviously depends on the potential effect size as in your assumptions. With an adaptive algorithm, with exactly the same parameters, you can have the same statistical power at around 550 participants. So that is a significant reduction. Now, obviously, for safety, some studies choose not to go that low. They choose generally a number that's between that 550 and for adaptive and 1267. But that is a significant reduction. That's why we say you can generally reduce it by 20%. But the theoretical aspect is you can reduce it by 50% in some of these trials and you'll still keep the same statistical power. Another example for a trial that was completed was when looking at permitted blocks. Because of the number of covariates and stratification that was required in the trial, over 1,600 participants would have been required to complete the trial. Whereas with the use of adaptive algorithms, we were able to complete that with 850 participants. So obviously these are some of the better examples. The higher number of covariates you have, the higher the reduction. But these are extremely important in showcasing the effectiveness in actual live clinical trials, not just talking about theoretical statistical results. So that's why we believe this matters. And I think that's why these are some important things in lowering how to reduce cost and how to reduce the time in doing clinical trials, while making sure that the algorithms handle all of the statistics at the beginning. So they'll make sure that you don't have any outliers. They'll make sure that everything is balanced so that you don't have to worry at the end of the study, oh, we need to remove that subgroup or we need to remove those X patients simply because they're outliers or some of the data doesn't make sense for us. Next, we're going to talk a little bit as a summary. I've been talking quite a bit, so I'm going to just focus on the key benefits and then we'll go into the live demo. So first of all, the advantages are you can balance a high number of variables. You can support any type of variable, so not just categorical, continuous, mixed, and so on. You can balance across sites and within sites. This balancing happens at the patient enrollment, so that's when the statistics, all the tests are done there. And that's one of the key advantages because then at the end of the study, there's less issues that have to happen with the statistics, the grouping, subgrouping, the independent sample analysis, and so on. The key advantages are that it also reduces the overall number of subjects. By reducing the potential error rate, it improves the chances of detecting effects, which is obviously a key aspect. And it adapts to the reality of clinical trials when you have low enrolling sites, early termination, or new sites that have to be added on, or new treatments, or so on. Overall, the key aspect is reducing the cost and time of executing clinical trials. Next slide. So a couple of key components, just to be aware. So obviously for legislative purposes, you need to make sure that you have processes that support emergency unblinding, that support error handling. So all of these components are absolutely handled, and we provide all support for that, for being able to do emergency unblinding, approval workflows, either site level or patient level unblinding. So all of those can be handled electronically within the system without requiring any kind of paperwork, and making sure that you have the correct audit relevant information. Next. In terms of the randomization mechanism, it's very important to have backups for when the internet isn't working. So you can start this entire process from DFdiscover, so from the EDC, which is fantastic. But what happens if for whatever reason you can not access DFdiscover? Well, we do support other mechanisms. So you are able to randomize via phone, when I mean phone, I mean by calling a number, so by a landline, by SMS, so you can send a text or message to randomize, and offline. So these are some of the other capabilities to make sure that you can still enroll patients even when your internet is offline. Next slide, please. And in terms of the randomization within DFdiscover, so this is all fully integrated done within the platform. So when you go to your randomization plate, you enter whatever variables and covariates are required as part of your randomization, and you press Save, Submit. The system automatically contacts Diamind server. It populates Diamind server does all the checks, calculations, the statistics, and pushes back the information into the DFdiscover CRF so that you can see, again, depending on your role and permissions, you may be able to see the treatment group or the treatment code if you're blinded, who performed randomization, date, time, and so on, as well as being able to send all emails and notifications to notify that the new enrollment has happened or any other information that's relevant at randomization. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that you are able to do text and phone randomization. So this is done by the texting or calling a number. Local numbers are available based on the states or based on the country. Again, not all countries are fully supported simply because of local legislation. Some countries do not allow this type of use for phone numbers, but most North America, Europe, parts of Africa, Asia, all of these have at least a couple of countries. I mean, obviously, pretty much all of Europe and North America supports this, but there are countries essentially on pretty much all continents, and a lot of regions actually support these features, and hopefully more and more are changing the legislation to allow this type of use case. But the important thing, you are able to randomize via text or phone. You send a message, you have a unique ID as part of your profile that you can use to authorize and authenticate yourself, and with that and the information, you are able to enroll the patients. And what's really important is that the data automatically will flow into DFdiscover. So the same randomization CRF plate will be filled, the emails will go out and everything, even if you do not have internet access. Next slide, please. A quick overview on security and compliance. So we want to make sure that, first of all, the solution provides high availability. So you have multiple redundant copies of the application running at all times so that you can do randomizations 24/7. We support both cloud and on-prem deployments. So we can go with the chosen cloud provider and region, as well as if you want to have it within your IT perimeter, that's also available. I mentioned flexible geographic location. Obviously, all of the standard parts around security, so encryption at rest, encryption in transit, multi-factor authentication, role-based access controls, being able to control who can do what at what site, what data they can access, all of these are available, as well as making sure, obviously, that complete audit logging and all of this to be able to ensure either 21 CFR Part 11 compliance or FIPS 142 or 3, depending on if you use the newer or the older one for electronic and digital signature compliance. So that being said, I think this provides an excellent overview of the technical capabilities, but I think everyone has heard enough of me talking, so it's time to actually see some of these components. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Laura, who's going to show you how these items work in action.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm going to go through a couple of different scenarios for how the integration with eConsent and randomization can look. So the first one I'm going to focus on is both using electronic consent and randomization in DFdiscover in sort of a classical clinical trial situation where there's a site interacting directly with the patient at the site and performing randomization after the consent and enrollment process. So let's take a look at how this looks. So I'm logging into the eConsent portal. As a study coordinator, say I'm in the same room with the participant, I'm ready to start the consent process with them. So in the eConsent portal, I can go ahead and start the consent process, provide the subject ID if I need, or it would auto-populate the subject ID if that's a preference for your study. Provide my password to get the consent process started. And now I specify the consent details. So Alex talked earlier about the different types of consent and consent workflows that are available. And so here is where you, as the study coordinator or the investigator, would identify who's providing the consent, what's the type of consent, who's collecting it, and then give that approval to get started. And so here's the HTML version of the consent form that Alex mentioned earlier. So it's a copy paste basically from the consent form you send over to your IRB. So it's lots of information to make sure the patient is fully informed and includes any custom questions that you need to capture on your consent form. So here's a few different questions that the participant needs to answer. You know, they're actually on the tablet or the laptop, say, going through this and answering the questions. They're in the room with the study coordinator or the investigator. And so once I complete those questions, I now provide my name and my signature as a study participant. And as Alex mentioned, we provide a couple of different options for signatures. So you can either draw your signature just with your finger or your mouse within that little box there, or you have the option to type your signature. So once the participant has provided their signature and completed their part, then the person obtaining consent completes their part. And here You can see what the typing the password looks like. And then we have an option here on this consent form to provide a signature of the witness if that's required. This whole workflow and how the consent form is designed is based off your study requirements and can differ from site to site, as you would normally expect. Here's the investigator providing their signature alongside their name. And we also provide an option to send a copy of the consent to the participant via email so that they have a copy of the complete consent right away. You don't need to print it off and share it with them. It can just be sent to them by email. And then there's a final confirmation step, and then the consent process is complete. And the PDF copy of the patient consent is available right there. This is the same copy that gets sent over to the participant via email, so they see all the same information that they just saw on the screen, including any information they provided, any questions that they answered on the form, alongside each of the signatures for all of the parties involved in the consent process. So it's all laid out in one PDF. And the signature certificate that Alex mentioned as well is included as part of the consent documentation, so including all the different signatures that were included on that specific consent form on one page. And then here's a look at the email that the participant would receive with their consent form attached and a little message thanking them for agreeing to participate. So they have that consent form for their records. So then moving over to the EDC side of things, this is within DFWeb. So logging in again as a study coordinator, and I'm going to view the data for the subject that I just consented over in the eConsent system. So opening up their subject binder in the EDC system, I can see my eConsent integration CRF is already completed for me. So I already have data for this subject without ever doing anything in the EDC. And all that consent data that was just completed in the eConsent system is available for me. I'm happy I don't have to actually enter it. But I can go ahead now and enter the EDC data. So here in this example study, we have a demographics form that's completed. And I can just go ahead and fill out the other information required at the screening visit following the consent. We've got an inclusion/exclusion criteria, CRF here as well. We can confirm that the participant is eligible before we move on to the enrollment visit. And here I'm providing my signature to verify that the eligibility information is correct for this participant. So let's sort of skip forward in time to the enrollment visit for when we can actually do the randomization. So first I have my subject encounter CRF I want to fill out. The patient's attending the visit, no adverse events, no new medications, and then I can proceed to the randomization CRF. So here's where I'm specifying a number of different randomization variables. So that's all dependent on the information that's required for the randomization. And you can include all the data checks that are required to make sure you're actually capturing all the information you need for the randomization and that the data is consistent and valid. Do my final confirmation that the subject is eligible to randomize and confirm that I'm ready to proceed with randomization, and then saving that record. Connects to the Diamind system to obtain the randomization assignment. And I get my little pop-up window telling me the treatment arm that I'm assigned to, and then the CRF is auto-filled with all the randomization information. And what information here is shown, the treatment group is shown here, but it might just be a treatment code or a specific piece of information depending on what's required for your study. And then here's a look at the email notifications that are sent. And you can have different types of notifications sent to different types of people. Say you have an unblinded pharmacist who needs the specific code or information. A different email can be sent to different people who need to be informed of the randomization that just occurred. So that's the overall workflow from eConsent over to randomization within DFdiscover when integrated with Diamind. And the next example I want to show is the scenario where you're working with a patient remotely. So they're not attending a site, they're not talking with a specific study coordinator in person. This is all done actually remotely. So you want to send the consent to the participant via email and also send them instructions for getting started with ePro, DFEngage, our mobile application, to complete some surveys for the study. So here we just start within DFWeb. We don't need to go into the Diamind system. We just log into the EDC system to initiate the consent process in this case. So here I'm going to select a new subject from my list. And instead of completing the other screening material, I'm just going to go ahead and to the ready to consent CRF we have here and specify all the information about who's going to be involved in the consent process for this participant. So I'm putting my email address in so I can actually show you each of the emails that are received for each of these people as the consent process goes through. But this would involve, capturing the actual participant's information directly within the EDC, so you can communicate with the participant for the email and for the ePro. So once I save that information, that email goes over to begin with the participant, so they can provide the consent. So here's the email they would receive with a secure link to the eConsent. And this is just like what I was showing you earlier, but it's only for the study participant. So instead of having all the consent parties looking at the same page, this is the page just for the study participant. So you can see the same questions we saw earlier are being asked here. And so the study participant goes through each one of them. Their name is already pre-filled since we know it. The system knows it. I can provide my signature and confirm that everything looks good. And then once I click next, my part of the consent as a study participant is completed. And so that will then initiate the next person in line to sign off on the consent. So that means that the person obtaining consent, in this case, the study coordinator, is going to get their secure link to complete the consent process. And so they'll again see the same form, and they'll see all the information that has just been provided by the study participant, so they can see all their responses. And then they provide their signature and the other information required for the consent form, and finish their part as well. So this workflow all depends on how it's set up for your study, how this email-based consent process will work. Now the consent obtainer has signed off, and so finally the investigator will be the final step in this example scenario. So the investigator will receive their secure link. They'll see both the participant's information and signature, the study coordinator's information and signature, and then they can do their final sign-off to complete the full consent process. Now that we have everyone have provided consent, we've all got signatures collected, and we have that final PDF copy that can be sent to the participant and saved on record for the site as well. And so now that we have the full consent of the participant to go ahead in this project, the email will be sent. Let's look at the back at the ready to consent CRF in DF Web. So now we can see that the EDC is populated with that consent information now as well, so that there's no data entry needed from the site for when the consent is completed. And so here's the email to the participant with a copy of their consent form, as well as instructions for using ePro. So these are the instructions to set up DF Engage so that they can start completing surveys or other data for the questionnaire. So let's take a look at how that'll look on a mobile device. So we include a QR code or just a link that can be easily clicked on from the participant's mobile application. So here's just me scanning the QR code from the email to help me install and log in to DF Engage. So I provide my username and password that was given to me in my email. And I can go ahead and then set up my application. And so we set a PIN to make sure that the data is protected on the participant's device. I'm asked to allow notifications so that any reminders for surveys that will become available to me that'll show up on my phone, so I make sure I don't miss any. We also provide a training module for the participants so that they're guided through how to actually use the application, how to answer all the types of questions that might be available in DF Engage, and other aspects of using the app, so they're prepared to use the application even without having in-person training with site personnel. And now they're ready to go ahead and complete their surveys and provide the information that's required for the study that they consented to in the earlier step. So that's the overall look at how both the sort of a classical clinical trial eConsent and randomization process might work, as well as how you could use these systems also to obtain email-based consent with a participant in a remote setting, as well as start getting ePro data from them. So finally, I wanted to give a quick look at how the eConsent forms are set up in the Diamind system. So, of course, the plates that we saw in the EDC, the forms that we saw with randomization and with the ready to consent CRF, those are set up in DFdiscover, but the eConsent forms are set up in the eConsent system. And so you can set up as many consent forms as needed, so site-specific versions, multiple different types of consent forms, different consent types such as a surrogate or the emergency consent. And as Alex mentioned, there's two different styles. So the HTML version is where you can copy and paste text into a text box and apply any formatting that's required, or you can upload the PDF form and then define the fields directly on the PDF background as needed. So the signature pieces, as well as any questions that are answered. And so there's two different styles. They're kind of analogous to the eCRFs and the CRFs with backgrounds and DFdiscover for those who are familiar with the CRF setup on the DFdiscover side. So both the consent forms and our eCRFs provide that similar flexibility. So just to wrap up before we go into the Q&A session, we're really excited that we're now able to offer both eConsent and randomization now that we're partnering with Diamind to provide these solutions. As Alex mentioned, there's a lot of benefit to moving away from paper-based consents and moving into a digital system. And all the security and compliance aspects are available within the Diamind eConsent system. And with randomization, it was really exciting to hear Alex talk about, I don't personally understand all of the statistical methods behind it, but with the adaptive randomization algorithms, it's really exciting how it opens up potential for, some studies that could never get the funding to be done could actually get the funding done now because we're able to reduce those sample size, reduce the study timelines, reduce the cost. And so we would love to, we only were able to cover so much about these new capabilities in DFdiscover today. So we would love to hear from you if you have any further questions or would like to see more of the system and how that would work with DFdiscover.